March 12, 1943. Bismarck Sea, off the coast of New Guinea. Japanese Colonel Takeshi Nakamura stood on the bridge of destroyer Shikinami, binoculars pressed against his eyes as he scanned the horizon. 8 cargo vessels carrying 7,000 troops and critical supplies steamed toward Lee in tight formation. The convoy's success would reinforce their crumbling position in New Guinea. What he didn't know was that American medium bombers equipped with a devastating new weapon system were already hunting them. Those 8 forward-firing guns mounted in a modified nose would revolutionize anti-shipping warfare in a way no one had anticipated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Rachel Morrison had been flying B-25 Mitchell bombers for 18 months, but the aircraft sitting on the tarmac at Port Moresby looked different. The standard bombardier's greenhouse nose had been replaced with a solid metal fairing bristling with gun barrels. 4 50-caliber machine guns protruded from the lower section, 4 more jutted from the upper assembly. The sight made her pause during her pre-flight inspection. She ran her hand along the cool metal, feeling the weight of what this modification represented. Her crew chief, Master Sergeant Linda Hayes, watched with a knowing smile. The 53-year-old mechanic had spent 3 weeks installing the guns under absolute secrecy. Each weapon had been meticulously aligned to converge at 400 yards, creating a cone of destruction that could saw through metal like butter through bread. Rachel had flown dive bombing missions, skip bombing runs, and traditional high-altitude bombing operations, but this nose configuration transformed the medium bomber into something entirely new, a gun platform with the hitting power of a destroyer's broadside, concentrated into seconds of firing time. The modification concept had originated with Major Paul Davidson, a tactical innovator stationed in Australia, who believed conventional bombing against ships wasted ammunition and risked aircraft unnecessarily. High-altitude bombing against moving vessels achieved hit rates below 5%. Dive bombing exposed aircraft to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Skip bombing required approaching at masthead height through walls of defensive fire. Davidson's solution was elegantly brutal. Approach at wave-top altitude. Point the entire aircraft at the target like a giant gun sight. Unleash concentrated firepower that would shred superstructure, kill gun crews, and ignite ammunition before the enemy could effectively respond. Then drop bombs as the bomber pulled up and over the target. The Royal Australian Air Force had experimented with similar modifications, but American engineers had perfected the concept. The B-25's Mitchell provided an ideal platform. Sturdy construction that could absorb battle damage. Twin Wright R2600 engines providing reliable power. Sufficient speed to escape after attacking. Large enough to carry both the gun package and a meaningful bomb load. Intelligence reports indicated the Japanese convoy would pass through Huon Gulf before dawn on March 3rd. The convoy consisted of 8 transport ships carrying reinforcements. 7 destroyers and 8 fighters would provide protection. Previous attempts to interdict Japanese shipping had achieved limited results. Bombers flying at medium altitude dropped their weapons and hoped for hits. Fighters strafed with machine guns that barely scratched armored vessels. The Japanese had grown confident in their ability to run convoys through contested waters. That confidence was about to be shattered in the most violent way imaginable. Rachel attended the mission briefing with 23 other B-25 crews. The operations tent buzzed with nervous energy as pilots, co-pilots, navigators, and gunners crowded around the maps. Colonel James Henderson, commanding officer of the 38th Bomb Group, stood before a large chart of the Bismarck Sea. His pointer tapped specific locations as he outlined the attack plan. Reconnaissance aircraft had located the convoy steaming southwest at 12 knots. Current position placed them approximately 200 miles from their destination. Weather conditions were deteriorating, with low clouds and rain squalls providing cover for the approach. The attack would be coordinated across multiple squadrons. 12 B-17 Flying Fortresses would strike first from medium altitude, forcing the convoy to maneuver and suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Then, the modified B-25's would sweep in at masthead height in groups of 4. Each bomber would target a specific vessel. The concentrated firepower from 8 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously would be unlike anything the Japanese had experienced. Rachel studied the attack diagram with growing understanding of the tactic's brutal simplicity. No complex bombing calculations, no worrying about wind drift or altitude corrections. Simply point the nose at the target and press the trigger. The 8 guns firing in unison would deliver 160 rounds per second. Each 50-caliber bullet carried tremendous kinetic energy. Armor-piercing rounds could penetrate steel plate. Incendiary rounds could ignite fuel and ammunition. The combination would be devastating against thin-skinned transport vessels packed with troops and supplies. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, Rachel's co-pilot, leaned close and whispered her concerns. The modified nose meant no bombardier, no defensive position protecting the front of the aircraft. If they faced head-on attacks from Japanese fighters, they would be vulnerable. Rachel acknowledged the risk, but pointed out the tactical advantages. The forward-firing guns could engage surface targets that conventional bombers couldn't touch. The ability to strafe and bomb in a single pass would revolutionize maritime attack. Sometimes innovation required accepting new vulnerabilities while exploiting new capabilities. The weather forecast predicted scattered rain showers and low cloud cover, ceiling between 800 and 1,500 feet, visibility varying from 2 to 5 miles depending on precipitation. The conditions would conceal their approach until the last moment. Japanese radar technology was limited. Their lookouts would be scanning for high-altitude bombers, not aircraft skimming the wave tops. Surprise would be total if they executed the approach correctly. Captain Morrison's crew completed their pre-flight inspection as dawn broke over Port Moresby. The B-25, designated Black Widow, carried full fuel tanks, 800 rounds per gun in the nose package, and 4 500-pound general-purpose bombs in the internal bay. Total takeoff weight pushed the aircraft near maximum limits. The runway at Port Moresby was pierced steel planking laid across graded coral. Not ideal for heavy aircraft, but adequate for the mission. Rachel advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling the Mitchell accelerate down the strip. The tail came up at 60 miles per hour. At 95 miles per hour, she eased back on the yoke and the bomber lifted into humid morning air. Behind her, 11 more B-25's followed at 30-second intervals. The formation assembled over the harbor before turning northeast toward the Bismarck Sea. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Flying at 50 feet above the ocean required intense concentration. The propellers churned close enough to the water that salt spray coated the windscreen within minutes. Jennifer operated the windscreen wipers continuously, while Rachel focused on maintaining altitude and formation position. The other B-25 spread out in loose formation, each pilot fighting the same battle against spatial disorientation and fatigue. The ocean surface provided few visual references. Wave patterns created hypnotic effects that could lull pilots into dangerous altitude deviations. Rachel developed a scan pattern. Check airspeed indicator. Verify altitude above the waves. Scan engine instruments. Look ahead for the formation leader. Check left and right for wingman. Return to airspeed indicator. The cycle repeated every few seconds, building situational awareness through disciplined observation. Her hands and feet made constant small corrections to throttle, stick, and rudder. The B-25 was not an easy aircraft to fly in formation at low altitude. It required physical strength and mental endurance that pushed pilots to their limits. The modified nose changed the bomber's handling characteristics subtly. The additional weight of 8 machine guns and ammunition affected the center of gravity. Rachel had spent hours learning the aircraft's new flight envelope during training flights. The Mitchell still flew well, but required slightly more forward pressure on the control column during landing. Takeoff performance remained adequate, though acceleration was marginally reduced. The most significant change was psychological. Looking through the windscreen and seeing 8 gun barrels protruding ahead created a predatory feeling. This was no longer just a bomber hauling explosives to distant targets. This was a weapons platform designed to get close and personal with the enemy. The guns represented a fundamental shift in how medium bombers could be employed. Instead of dropping ordnance from safe distances, they would press attacks to point-blank range, where missing became nearly impossible. Lieutenant Commander Robert Chin, the squadron navigator aboard the lead B-25, provided course corrections via radio. His dead reckoning calculations accounted for wind drift and magnetic variation across the 200-mile flight. Navigation over featureless ocean tested even experienced navigators. A single degree of heading error sustained over an hour could place the formation miles off course. Chin cross-checked his calculations using multiple methods: estimated time of arrival based on airspeed and distance, sun angle measurements using a sextant adapted for aerial navigation, comparison of actual flight time against predicted intervals between waypoints. The Japanese convoy would be moving while the bombers flew their intercept course. Chin had to calculate not where the ships were, but where they would be when the bombers arrived. The mental geometry required visualizing speeds, headings, and closing rates in 3 dimensions. A mistake would send 24 bombers searching empty ocean while burning irreplaceable fuel. Weather conditions deteriorated as predicted. Rain squalls appeared ahead like gray curtains hanging from low clouds. Rachel flew through the first squall with windscreen wipers at maximum speed. Visibility dropped to less than a quarter mile. The formation loosened further to prevent mid-air collisions. Each pilot flew by instruments and faith, trusting that their squadron mates maintained proper spacing. Emerging from the squall into relatively clear air felt like surfacing from underwater. Rachel blinked away fatigue and refocused on the mission. Her hands ached from gripping the control wheel. Her shoulders burned from maintaining constant pressure against the controls. Flying a B-25 at low altitude for 2 hours was physically exhausting work. Modern pilots with hydraulic controls and autopilots couldn't appreciate the raw strength required to maneuver these bombers. Every input required muscular force transmitted through cables and pulleys to control surfaces. After 90 minutes of flight, she rotated her shoulders and flexed her fingers to maintain blood flow. The radio crackled with a terse message from the lead bomber. Contact ahead. Bearing 045, range approximately 20 miles. Rachel's pulse quickened as adrenaline flooded her system. 20 miles meant roughly 8 minutes until visual contact. 8 minutes to prepare mentally for what came next. She glanced at Jennifer, who was already checking ammunition counters and verifying that all systems showed green. In the back of the aircraft, Technical Sergeant Maria Rodriguez manned the twin 50-caliber machine guns in the dorsal turret. She had been rotating the turret continuously, scanning for Japanese fighters that might appear from any direction. Sergeant Thomas Miller operated the single 50 caliber in the ventral position, though his field of fire was limited by the bomb bay. The crew was as ready as training and experience could make them. Now they would discover if the new tactics worked against a real enemy, who would be shooting back. The Japanese convoy appeared as dark silhouettes against lighter ocean, 8 cargo vessels in 2 columns, destroyers positioned on the flanks and ahead of the formation. The ships were making turns to evade the B-17's attacking from medium altitude. White splashes marked near misses as bombs fell around the maneuvering vessels. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black puffs of exploding shells. Tracers arced upward in streams of deadly light. The scene looked like something from a naval battle painting, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Rachel pushed those thoughts aside and focused on her assigned target, a large transport vessel in the port column, approximately 4,000 tons displacement, painted in dull gray camouflage, superstructure amidships with cargo holds forward and aft, deck crowded with troops and equipment lashed down under canvas covers. That ship represented hundreds of enemy soldiers who would fight American and Australian forces if they reached shore. Rachel's job was to ensure they never arrived. The approach felt surreal, flying straight at a ship that was firing everything it had directly at her aircraft. The transport's anti-aircraft guns opened up when the B-25's closed to 3,000 yards. Orange muzzle flashes sparkled along the deck. Tracers reached out like fingers trying to swat the approaching bombers. Rachel held her course steady as her mind calculated closing speed and firing range. At 1,000 yards, she would open fire. Until then, she had to fly through defensive fire without flinching. A less experienced pilot might have jinked and weaved, throwing off their aim while approaching. Rachel understood that the straight approach was actually safer. The Japanese gunners had to lead a fast-moving target. Any deviation from steady flight made their calculations easier by showing them which direction she was turning. Hold steady. Trust the armor plate behind the instrument panel. Trust the self-sealing fuel tanks. Trust the right engines to keep running despite battle damage. Trust her training and instincts honed over 18 months of combat flying. 1,200 yards. The transport ship grew larger in the windscreen with every second. Rachel could see individual crew members running across the deck, gun crews servicing their weapons, officers on the bridge gesturing urgently. These were human beings who would die in the next minute. She pushed away the thought and focused on her tactical objective. This was war. They would kill her just as readily if given the chance. Humanity was a luxury warriors couldn't afford during combat. 1,000 yards. Rachel's thumb found the firing button on the control wheel. She made a final sight picture adjustment, ensuring the nose pointed directly at the transport's waterline, just forward of the superstructure. Then she pressed the button and held it down. 8 50 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously with a sound like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times. The B-25 shuddered from the recoil as 160 rounds per second hammered toward the target. Armor-piercing bullets punched through thin steel plate as if it were paper. Incendiary rounds ignited anything flammable they touched. The concentration of fire was beyond anything infantry weapons could achieve. This was industrial-scale violence delivered in seconds. The transport's bow disintegrated under the onslaught. Metal peeled away in ragged sheets. Deck fittings exploded into fragments. Troops caught in the open were cut down instantly. The anti-aircraft gun crews disappeared in red mist as 50 caliber rounds found them. Rachel walked her fire up the length of the ship, hosing the superstructure and deck with devastating precision. Glass shattered, metal buckled, wood splintered. The bridge structure collapsed as supporting columns were severed by concentrated fire. Ammunition stored on deck for the anti-aircraft guns detonated in a secondary explosion that lifted the entire bow section momentarily. Fire blossomed from a dozen points as incendiary rounds found fuel lines and stored gasoline. The transport was dying before Rachel even released her bombs. At 500 yards, Rachel eased back on the control wheel and pressed the bomb release button. 4 500-pound bombs dropped in sequence from the internal bay. The B-25 leapt upward as 2,000 pounds of weight fell away. Rachel banked hard right to avoid flying through debris and smoke from the stricken transport. She caught a glimpse of her bombs impacting along the ship's center line. Orange fireballs merged with the existing flames. The transport's back broke audibly, a grinding metallic shriek that carried across the water. The vessel began settling by the bow as water rushed into compartments torn open by bombs and machine gun fire. Secondary explosions rippled through the hull as fire reached stored ammunition and fuel. Within 90 seconds of Rachel's attack run, the transport was doomed beyond any possibility of salvage. Rachel had already spotted the warship and was calculating whether they had ammunition and position for a second attack. The destroyer presented a harder target with armor protection and more concentrated anti-aircraft firepower, but the principle remained the same. Get close, point the nose, press the button. Let physics and ballistics do their work. Rachel aligned on the destroyer's stern quarter, where armor was thinnest. The warship's captain was maneuvering violently, trying to bring his main battery to bear while presenting a difficult firing solution to the bombers. His efforts were valiant, but ultimately futile against aircraft attacking from masthead height at 400 miles per hour. Rachel opened fire at 800 yards. The 8 nose guns poured fire into the destroyer's stern. Depth charges lashed to the fantail exploded when incendiary rounds cooked off their detonators. The blast lifted the stern 15 feet out of the water and shattered the propeller shafts. The destroyer slewed sideways, losing steerage and speed. Rachel didn't have bombs remaining for a follow-up attack. She banked away as another B-25 swept in to finish what she had started. The second bomber's guns chewed through the destroyer's superstructure before releasing bombs that struck amidships. The warship rolled onto its side within minutes, spilling crew members and equipment into oil-slicked water. The battle evolved into controlled chaos as more B-25s pressed their attacks. Each bomber selected targets and made firing runs that lasted less than 30 seconds from trigger press to bomb release. The Japanese ships had no effective defense against this tactic. Their anti-aircraft guns were designed to engage aircraft at medium altitude where they could track and predict flight paths. Bombers attacking from wave-top height gave gunners only seconds to react. By the time they swung their weapons to bear, the B-25s had already fired, dropped bombs, and banked away, trailing smoke from their guns. Rachel reformed with her squadron and prepared for the return flight to Port Moresby. Her hands trembled slightly from adrenaline come-down as the immediate danger passed. She forced herself to focus on flying the aircraft and maintaining formation. Behind them, the Japanese convoy burned. 6 of 8 transports were sinking or dead in the water. Both destroyers were gone or crippled. Thousands of troops who would have reinforced Japanese positions in New Guinea were now swimming in the Bismarck Sea or trapped aboard burning ships. The strategic impact would be enormous. Without those reinforcements and supplies, Japanese forces at Lae would be unable to hold against Allied advances. The entire New Guinea campaign had shifted in the span of 30 minutes, and it had been achieved through tactical innovation that transformed medium bombers into ship killers. The return flight tested Rachel's endurance more than the attack had. Adrenaline faded, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Her arms felt like lead weights as she maintained formation position. Every muscle ached from the tension of combat flying. Jennifer took control for stretches to give Rachel's hands and shoulders relief. They traded off every 15 minutes, one pilot flying while the other monitored instruments and scanned for enemy fighters. The crew remained silent except for necessary communications. Each person processed what they had witnessed in their own way. The violence had been extreme even by wartime standards.
Men swept from decks by walls of bullets, vessels breaking in half and sinking within minutes. War stripped away pretense and revealed itself as organized brutality delivered with industrial efficiency. Rachel understood that what they had accomplished would change naval warfare fundamentally. The modified B-25 had proven itself as a devastating anti-shipping weapon. Other squadrons would adopt the tactics, engineers would refine the modifications. The 8-gun nose would become standard equipment rather than experimental innovation. Future battles would see dozens or hundreds of bombers employing these methods against Japanese convoys throughout the Pacific. The tactical revolution they had demonstrated over the Bismarck Sea would ripple forward through the rest of the war. She felt no pride in killing, but deep satisfaction in mission accomplishment. Those transport ships would never deliver their troops and supplies to enemy positions. American and Australian soldiers advancing in New Guinea would face weaker opposition because of what happened today. The calculus of war measured success in lives saved on your side versus lives taken on theirs. By that cold mathematics, this mission had been extraordinarily successful. Port Moresby appeared ahead after 3 hours of flight. The pierced steel runway looked beautiful despite its industrial ugliness. Rachel guided the B-25 through final approach with Jennifer calling out airspeeds and altitudes. The Mitchell touched down smoothly despite Rachel's fatigue. She taxied to their designated parking area where ground crews waited anxiously. As soon as the engines shut down, crew chiefs swarmed the aircraft to assess battle damage. Black Widow had taken hits. 17 bullet holes stitched across the fuselage and wings. One hydraulic line severed, but redundant systems had maintained function. The starboard engine showed oil leaking from a cracked fitting. Minor damage considering the intensity of defensive fire they had flown through. The armor plating behind the cockpit had stopped several rounds that would have killed Rachel and Jennifer. Modern materials and thoughtful design had saved their lives while they delivered death to the enemy. War was filled with such bitter ironies. The debriefing lasted 2 hours as intelligence officers questioned every crew about their observations. Rachel provided detailed accounts of her 2 attack runs, the transport ship disintegrating under machine gun fire before bombs even struck, the destroyer's depth charges detonating and breaking its back, the chaos of multiple simultaneous attacks overwhelming Japanese defensive capabilities. Intelligence analysts compiled reports from all crews to build a complete picture of the battle. Initial estimates suggested 6 transports sunk, 2 damaged beyond salvage, 3 destroyers sunk, 2 heavily damaged. Approximately 3,000 Japanese troops killed in the water or trapped aboard burning ships. Perhaps 2,000 more would make it to shore, but without equipment or supplies. The convoy had been effectively annihilated as a fighting force. The cost to American forces was remarkably light. 1 B-25 lost to anti-aircraft fire with crew missing and presumed killed. 2 bombers damaged but repairable. No fighter losses since Japanese air cover had been minimal and poorly coordinated. The exchange ratio was almost unbelievable. 1 bomber and 6 crew members lost in exchange for destroying an entire enemy convoy. Major Elizabeth Thornton, Squadron Operations Officer, studied the gun camera footage with intense interest. The film showed what words could barely describe: solid streams of tracers converging on ship targets, metal structures disintegrating under sustained fire, explosions blossoming across decks and superstructures.
The 8-gun nose had delivered firepower equivalent to a destroyer's broadside in a fraction of the time. Each bomber had become a flying weapons platform capable of inflicting catastrophic damage in seconds. Thornton immediately recognized the broader implications. This tactic could be applied against any surface target. Airfields could be strafed with devastating effect. Ground installations could be suppressed before conventional bombing. The modification transformed medium bombers from strategic weapons requiring careful planning into tactical weapons that could respond rapidly to emerging targets. The flexibility would prove invaluable as the Pacific Campaign evolved from defensive fighting to offensive operations pushing toward Japan itself. Colonel Henderson addressed the assembled crews that evening. He spoke plainly about what they had accomplished and what it meant for future operations. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a turning point in the air war over the Pacific. Japanese forces could no longer assume their convoys were safe, even with destroyer escorts and fighter protection. American bombers had demonstrated the ability to locate, attack, and destroy shipping with unprecedented effectiveness. The psychological impact on Japanese naval planning would be significant. Every future convoy would require heavier escorts. More resources diverted to defensive operations meant fewer available for offensive actions. The strategic initiative was shifting decisively toward Allied forces. Henderson also addressed the human cost openly. War required killing enemy soldiers before they could kill your own people. Nobody should take pleasure in death, but neither should they feel excessive guilt about necessary actions. The Japanese troops who died in the Bismarck Sea would have fought against Allied soldiers in New Guinea. By sinking those transports, the bomber crews had saved countless American and Australian lives. The moral calculation was clear, even if emotionally difficult. Rachel lay in her cot that night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. Images replayed endlessly. The transport ship breaking apart, men falling into the ocean, the destroyer exploding. She had killed dozens, perhaps hundreds of enemy soldiers in less than 2 minutes of firing. Her finger on the trigger had unleashed industrial violence that overwhelmed human-scale comprehension. War reduced individuals to targets and survival to mathematics. She wondered about the Japanese colonel she had spotted on the destroyer's bridge. Had he survived? Had he understood in those final moments that his tactical assumptions were fatally flawed? Did he realize that American ingenuity had created a weapon system against which his forces had no effective defense? These questions had no answers. War moved forward relentlessly. Tomorrow would bring new missions against new targets. She would fly and fight until the war ended or she died. That was the contract she had accepted when she pinned on her wings. The tactical analysis conducted over the following weeks confirmed that the 8-gun nose modification represented a fundamental shift in capabilities. Traditional bombing tactics achieved hit rates below 10% against maneuvering ships. The new strafing approach combined with skip bombing pushed hit rates above 70%. The difference was mathematical certainty versus hopeful probability. When you pointed 8 machine guns at a ship from 500 yards and held the trigger for 10 seconds, you hit the target. Physics guaranteed it.
The only variables were how much damage you inflicted and whether you survived defensive fire long enough to deliver the attack. Both questions favored the attacker when surprise was achieved and approach altitude minimized the defender's reaction time. The numbers told a story that would reshape American tactical doctrine for maritime attack. Engineers studied battle damage and gun camera footage to refine the modifications. Some crews requested additional nose guns to increase firepower further. Others wanted improved armor protection around the cockpit. Ammunition storage was redesigned to improve feeding reliability during sustained firing. The gun sight was upgraded with better optics for target acquisition at low altitude. Each improvement built on combat experience and transformed theoretical designs into proven weapons. The evolution from experimental modification to standardized equipment happened rapidly because the need was urgent and the results were undeniable. Within 6 months, hundreds of B-25's throughout the Pacific theater would carry the 8-gun nose. The weapon system that Rachel had helped prove in combat would become synonymous with American medium bombers in the maritime attack role. Rachel flew 37 more combat missions over the next year. She attacked Japanese shipping, bombed airfields, and supported ground operations throughout New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Each mission added to her understanding of how air power could influence ground campaigns. She learned to identify targets from minimal intelligence. She developed instincts for when to press attacks and when to break off. She trained new pilots arriving from the United States with minimal combat experience. The lessons she passed on were written in the blood of crews who had learned the hard way what worked and what got you killed. Combat was the ultimate teacher. Brutal and unforgiving, but absolutely honest. What worked kept you alive. What didn't work killed you. The feedback was immediate, and the curriculum was written by necessity. Lieutenant Walsh was promoted to captain and given her own aircraft after demonstrating exceptional skill during a mission where they lost an engine over enemy territory. Jennifer had kept the crippled B-25 flying for 90 miles back to base through a combination of technical knowledge and sheer determination. Rachel recommended her for command and watched with satisfaction as her former co-pilot excelled. Good leaders created more leaders rather than hoarding authority. The Air Force needed skilled combat pilots more than it needed individuals accumulating victory credits. Rachel found more satisfaction in watching her students succeed than in adding to her own mission count. That perspective marked the difference between warriors who served a cause and those who served their own egos. The broader strategic situation in the Pacific shifted dramatically throughout 1943 and 1944. Allied forces captured Japanese positions throughout New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The advance toward the Philippines gained momentum as American industrial production overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities. Each month brought new aircraft, new ships, new weapons that tipped the balance further toward inevitable Allied victory. The 8-gun B-25 played its role in this transformation. Japanese convoys learned to avoid daylight movement near Allied air bases. Supply lines contracted as shipping losses mounted. Ground forces fought without adequate support because the logistical system collapsed under sustained air attack. The weapon system that Rachel had helped prove in combat became one piece of a larger puzzle that ultimately defeated Japanese ambitions in the Pacific.
Rachel received orders in August 1944, transferring her stateside to train new pilots. She had completed 83 combat missions and earned numerous decorations, including the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters. Her survival owed partly to skill and partly to luck. She had seen too many talented pilots die to believe skill alone guaranteed survival. Combat aviation was inherently dangerous, and enemy fire added lethal randomness to every mission. You could do everything right and still die because a shell fragment hit a critical component. Or you could make mistakes and survive because the enemy gunner missed by inches. The randomness troubled her more than the danger. She preferred situations where skill and preparation determined outcomes. War denied that preference and forced acceptance of uncertainty as a constant companion. The training base in Arizona felt surreal after 2 years in the combat zones. Clean facilities with hot water, regular meals prepared by cooks rather than scrounged from limited supplies. Aircraft maintained to peacetime standards rather than kept flying through improvisation. The new pilots arriving for training were young and enthusiastic, filled with confidence born from inexperience. Rachel remembered being that confident before combat taught her the difference between bravery and survival. Her job was teaching these young pilots everything she had learned without crushing their spirit. They needed confidence to fly combat missions, but they also needed realistic understanding of what awaited them. The balance was delicate. Too much emphasis on danger bred hesitation. Too little bred carelessness. She aimed for informed courage backed by technical competence. Rachel's lectures focused on practical lessons learned through experience. How to approach ships at the correct angle to maximize firepower while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. How to identify which parts of a target would yield the best results from machine gun fire. How to manage ammunition consumption during multiple attack runs. How to recognize when to press an attack and when survival dictated breaking off. These lessons couldn't be learned from manuals. They came from watching attacks succeed and fail, from seeing crews live and die, from making decisions under fire and living with consequences. She spoke plainly about the realities of combat aviation. You would be terrified during your first mission. Fear was normal and healthy. Anyone who claimed otherwise was lying or delusional. The key was functioning despite fear, flying the aircraft and completing the mission even while your hands shook and your heart raced. Courage was an absence of fear. Courage was acting appropriately despite being terrified. The tactical innovations that began with the 8-gun nose continued evolving throughout the war. Engineers developed even more devastating modifications. Some B-25's carried 12 or even 14 forward-firing guns. Others mounted 75mm cannons for attacking hardened targets. The original concept of using medium bombers as gun platforms spawned multiple variations as tactical requirements evolved. Each innovation built on lessons learned from combat operations. The process demonstrated how military organizations could adapt and improve when they remained flexible and listened to combat veterans rather than clinging to pre-war doctrine. The Air Force that emerged from World War II bore little resemblance to the force that entered the war in 1941. Combat had forged better tactics, better training, and better integration between air and ground operations. She thought about all the Japanese soldiers who had died in the Bismarck Sea and countless other battles. They had been enemies, but they had also been human beings with families and dreams. War had reduced them to targets and obstacles. The dehumanization necessary for combat troubled her, even as she understood its necessity. Perhaps that contradiction defined the warrior's burden. You did terrible things for necessary reasons and carried the weight of those actions for the rest of your life. Rachel left active duty in 1946, but remained in the Air Force Reserve. She flew occasionally to maintain proficiency, but spent most of her energy on civilian pursuits. She earned degrees in engineering and aeronautics. She worked as a consultant for aircraft manufacturers, applying combat experience to design improvements. She wrote technical articles about tactical aviation that influenced how the next generation of officers thought about air power. Her legacy extended beyond the missions she flew or the enemy forces she destroyed. She had helped prove that innovation and adaptation could transform warfare. The 8-gun B-25 modification that seemed radical in early 1943 became standard doctrine by war's end. That transformation happened because people were willing to question assumptions and try new approaches, even when conventional wisdom said otherwise. The lessons from that period resonated through Rachel's remaining years. Innovation required courage to challenge established methods. Success required combining technical capability with tactical creativity. Victory required organizations that listened to combat veterans and adapted based on actual experience rather than theoretical preferences. These principles applied beyond military aviation. They were fundamental truths about how humans solved complex problems under pressure. Rachel carried those lessons into every endeavor after the war. She became known as someone who questioned assumptions and pushed for better solutions rather than accepting mediocrity. The habits forged in combat served her well in peace. The discipline required to fly damaged bombers home translated into persistence when facing civilian challenges. The courage needed to press attacks against defended targets became courage to advocate unpopular positions when she believed she was right. In the final analysis, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented more than just a tactical victory. It demonstrated that creativity and determination could overcome conventional limitations. A medium bomber not designed for anti-shipping work became one of the most effective ship killers in the Pacific theater. The transformation required technical innovation, tactical creativity, and combat veterans willing to risk their lives testing new concepts. Rachel had been part of that process, and the experience shaped everything that followed. She understood that progress came from people willing to challenge assumptions and try new approaches despite uncertainty and risk. That lesson proved more valuable than any medal or decoration. It was wisdom purchased through combat and validated through survival. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Up next,